So as Sheikh Tajri mentioned, this is based on my work at Royal Holloway on organ donation in Shi'i jurisprudence. And the reason why I wanted to do it now is because there's actually been a change in the law. So we've switched to an opt-out system. So it's made the question of organ donation and can Muslims donate organs relevant, a lot more relevant. So up till now, we had this system which is called an opt-in system. So you decide maybe when you're filling out a driver's license or you go onto the NHS website and you choose to donate organs. And it's up to you, you say which organs you want to donate and which ones you don't want to donate. Now recently, this is probably as of the last 2 weeks, this new bill called the Organ Donation Deemed Consent Act has come into law, has come into the legislation. And what this does is it basically flips the presumption. So everybody is presumed to have consented to donating their organs unless you specifically opt out of it. And it will take a little while for it to come into implementation. So by this time next year, this will be the new system that we have. We've already got systems like this in Wales, and Scotland have said that they want to implement the same system as well. The medical bodies have been pushing for these changes for like the last 20 years because they say that the majority of British people have already said that they want to donate organs, but most of them haven't signed on to the register. So by bringing this change, hopefully it'll lead to a lot more lives being saved, and also it'll lead to a cultural change. So the way that we view organ donation will change. It will become the norm for us and not the exception. There's been some concerns. I don't know if you ever received that text message that there's been a change in the law and they'll just take all of your organs and you have to be careful and you have to opt out of it. This is scaremongering because it's actually a soft opt-out system. So even if you haven't opted out, when it does come into play, they would still ask family members. They wouldn't just go and take organs without people being happy with it. But then this obviously raises the question about, as a Muslim, do you have to opt out or not? Because all this time we've kind of ignored this question, whereas now you have to actually choose to opt out of saving a life, which seems a bit counterintuitive and counter to what Islam teaches. So there's been a need to increase Muslim donors, and the government has been working on this for a number of years, even before this change came into play. So although organ donation, it saves lives and improves the quality of lives of a lot of people, there's still a massive shortage of people who choose to become donors, and this results in 3 people losing their lives daily just waiting for an organ. Also, for those who can live without an organ transplantation, so without receiving a kidney and they can just receive dialysis instead, that doesn't give them the same quality of life as a transplant would, and it's really expensive on the NHS, so it would cost about £30,000 per person per annum just to receive that treatment in place. The majority of the UK's Muslims are from South Asian background, and people from that background are more likely to develop kidney failure, and that means they would either require a kidney transplantation or they have to go on dialysis for all of their life. Similarly, children from Muslim backgrounds are more likely to suffer from congenital heart disease, which means that they need a heart transplant, and that's even more complicated because they would require a donor who is another child, and that if people don't want to give their own organs, they're even less likely to consent on behalf of children. Now, although you can have a transplantation from anyone as a donor, a suitable organ is most likely to come from someone who has the same ethnicity as you. But what they found is that people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds in the UK are much less likely to donate organs. So they only make up 2% of the deceased kidney donors, even though they make up 17% of the active transplant waiting list. So it's worse for people from ethnic minorities, and Muslims happen to be from that ethnic minority, so there's an even greater need for Muslim organ donors. And if you're living somewhere like Birmingham, which is densely populated by Muslims, then you have a much longer wait period. It can be up to 4 or 5 years. So the government and NHS, they commissioned a lot of studies on Muslim attitudes towards organ donation, And what they found was, they were doing surveys, and what they found was a lot of people say that, Muslim people say that they support organ donation, but they don't know if it's allowed in their religion, or they think it's not allowed because of religious scriptures or the way that those religious scriptures have been interpreted. So what I did for my study was to say, how is this relevant to Shia Muslims? And because of our structures of authority, what I did was look at the fatwas of contemporary maraja, and to look at how they've responded to questions about organ donation. And what was most important for me is to try and understand how they come out with the ruling that they come out with. What I found was that there were two issues. The first thing is, you usually have like 1 or 2 sentences dealing with organ donation. So if you look at Ayatollah Sistani's website, either in his fatwa, it's like 1 or 2 lines, or even in the question and answer, it's 1 or 2 lines. It's not the evidence that, if you look at fiqh al-istidlali, that's not there. So that's what I wanted to know. How do you arrive at this? What is your evidence? And that's, for contemporary issues, just isn't present in most cases. And the second issue is that we're not really sure what the practical implications are. So you'll have a line or something saying that it is necessary for a Muslim to donate if it will save the life of another Muslim. And I'm not sure what that means in my context. Can I donate? Can I not donate? Because I don't know that it's going to go to a Muslim or not after I die. And then if you just quickly compare this with other fiqh councils and judicial councils, so these are made up of Sunnis and Shias. They're in Makkah, Kuwait, even in the UK, you'll see that they usually hold like large conferences. They'll talk to doctors, talk to scientists, and then they'll come out with a unified statement. And often they'll have a lot of reasoning as well. So if we compare the two, what we have to work with is a lot less. So obviously for an opt-out system, we're just looking at organ donation after death, and not so much can you donate organs during your lifetime. What I found was that there's 3 main issues that make it contentious to donate organs after you pass away. The first issue is, how do you define death? Because actually there's 2 standards of death now, which we'll come on to in a little while. It's called brainstem death or brain death, where your heart is still beating, and that's legally and medically, that's already considered to be death. Is that death in Islam or not? The second issue is organ donation considered to be mutilation of a corpse? Because we have lots and lots of narrations that talk about how important it is to care for the deceased and to treat them with respect. So would taking out an organ be disrespecting them or not? And the third issue is, who can a Muslim donate to? Is there any restriction? Are you allowed to donate to anybody, or does it have to be another Muslim? Somebody did a review of 52 marjas, and he found that the majority say that organ donation is allowed if it can save the life of a Muslim, or they go further than that and say you have to take the organ if it's if you need it to save the life of a Muslim, even if they haven't left any kind of will. If we compare this to during life, which I know is outside of the scope of this, but during life there's no problem with donating organs. It doesn't seem to be contentious for anyone. The only issue during life is, as long as it's not going to result in your own death, or it's not going to cause you serious harm. So for example, they'll say you can't donate an eye because that would be serious harm. Then you're allowed to donate your organs, so most likely the kidney, because you've got 2. And also, there's no restriction based on who you donate it to. So at that point, whilst you're alive, it's up to you. You can donate to a Muslim or a non-Muslim, but after death, we see that this becomes a big issue for some reason. Okay. So starting with the first problem and the most complicated problem, how do we define death? Traditionally, we've always understood death to be when your heart stops beating and you stop breathing. But because of different changes and medical advancements, now we've got this notion called brain death or brainstem death. And that came about because of the invention of the artificial ventilator. So they found that a person whose brain had completely stopped working, you've got no consciousness, no abilities, you don't have any responses to no reflexes, you can't breathe by yourself, because usually it's the brain that instructs your lungs to breathe. That person can still be kept breathing and their heart will still be beating purely because of a machine. So what happened was medics and due to medics also the law, it changed, and they said, okay, a person who's brain dead, who is completely brain dead, who we've done all the tests and we know that they've got absolutely no brain function and their brain function will never be resumed, that is also considered to be death. So even whilst the person's body still looks like it's what we would understand as alive, while their heart is still beating and they're still breathing and they're still warm, legally and medically that can still be death if your brain is dead. Okay. So this standard has been adopted in the UK, in much of the Western world, and also in places like Iran now as well. So after you die, there's two types of deceased organ donors. The first type is people whose hearts have stopped beating, and if they die in conditions where they're in a hospital and they can extract the organs, then they will do that if you've chosen to be an organ donor. But the other type is brain dead donors. So you're in a hospital, your brain has stopped functioning, but your heart is still beating just because of a machine. And that's actually the preferred source of organs, because your organs are still being oxygenated, they're not decomposing, they're not dying, they're still working. And also that's the only way to have heart transplants from people at the moment, because once your heart stops beating, it starts to die and you can't use it anymore, although I think they're working on that now. So the majority of deceased organ donors in the UK are brain dead donors. So this then raises this obvious question: is brain death corresponding to death in Islam? Does Islam consider that to be death or not? Again, the review of the 52 marjas found that for the majority they don't consider brain death to be death in Islam, and some of them express skepticism because they say that, well, clearly there was utilitarian motivations here, so doctors found that, okay, we can take organs from these people, and also if we keep them if we keep them on this machine that uses up valuable resources. So some people think that was the motivation. And if you look at, I think, the Harvard committee, they initially had this report, they put forward those two reasons. They said, we've got these new developments, and what it means is that we're on the one hand wasting possible organs, and on the other hand we're using resources for people who we can never ever bring back at all. Okay, so starting with death in the Sharia sources, the first thing that you do, or the first point of reference when defining anything, you would look at the Quran and the Sunnah. A biomedical conference on human life held by the Islamic Organization for Medical Sciences and the Kuwait Foundation for Advancement of Sciences said that after they held this conference, they said that there's no definition in the Quran for death. What's generally understood by death is that when the spirit departs from the body, but it's difficult to know when exactly that happens. What we do know about the spirit is that it's something which we have very little knowledge of, so it's not something that we actually understand very well at all. There's narrations from Imam Sadiq that the relationship between the body and the soul is similar to the relationship between a jewel and the jewelry box. But beyond that, we don't really know when did death occur. We know that there's signs of death which have come in narration, so things like when the body starts to decompose. But again, that doesn't tell us about the point of death, it just tells us a sign that death has occurred. So in the absence of any definition in the Sharia sources, the question becomes, who's best placed to define death then? Who do we refer to tell us? If we can't find death in the Quran and the Sunnah, and we can't understand what it means from there, who tells us what death is? There's a growing number of marjas, especially from Iran, I think, who have moved to the notion, to this understanding that medical specialists should be defining death. So Ayatollah Khomeini is actually recognized as the first, not only Shia, but amongst the Muslims to recognize this notion of brain death, relying on medical convention. Similarly, Ayatollah Khamenei, Makarim Shirazi, and Ayatollah Fadlullah all consider brain death to be death, and they rely on medical specialists and they rely on doctors to inform us of what death is. Ayatollah Tabrizi, when he was asked, he said it's necessary to refer to the medical specialist in order to decide whether the first or the second conforms to the definition of death. Yep. And Ayatollah Fadlullah actually goes further, and he gave an analogy of a snake and the tail of a snake. So sometimes when a tail gets cut off, it has residual movement. But he says, well, this residual movement, that's not life itself. That's just something artificial or residual. If you contrast this and look at Ayatollah Sistani's ruling or his response to a question when he was asked what is death, or is a brain deaf person considered to be death, he says, well, death is what people understand death to be. So he relies on what regular people understand as death. So you have the two different options. One is, does a medical specialist define death, or does a general convention decide death? I'm not entirely sure why he relies on the general convention, because of course we don't know the evidence for that, but it would seem that a medical specialist and the medical convention is what informs the general understanding anyway in most cases. Like, for example, after heart attacks, people may have thought, okay, this person is now dead, or anyone who falls unconscious, a regular person might think is dead, but you would then refer to a doctor to go and try and tell you or give you a better understanding. This is the most complicated area, I think, and the least worked on. He's writing me notes. But moving on from that, the second issue is whether after we sort out what is death, or even after, because you can have two types of deceased organ donors, so even after your heart has stopped, you can become an organ donor. Is it allowed anyway? Or is it considered to be mutilation of the deceased, in which case it wouldn't be allowed? So we have a lot of prophetic narrations and a lot of narrations talking about how you should never mutilate the corpse, how much you should respect a dead body. To harm somebody who has passed away is as bad as harming somebody who is alive. There's a narration that breaking the bones of a dead Muslim is worse than breaking the bones of a Muslim who is alive. Note that it says Muslim in this narration as well, because that comes into play. So then the question is organ transplantation or procurement of organs in a clinical and medical setting, is that what we call mutilation or not? Here there's two views again. The traditional view says that yes, primarily it is considered mutilation and you are not allowed to do it, but because of secondary considerations, because you've got a conflicting obligation to save a life, in some cases you can do it. The second view says no, it's about the context of it. Mutilation means you're doing something intentional to cause harm. It's not just to take out an organ in a medical setting, which you do to save a life or improve a life. So going through the first view, and this is the most common view and it's the more traditional view. It relies on the principle of apparent meaning, asalat al-zuhur, which is one of the most important principles in interpreting the Quran and the Sunnah. And accordingly, because of these narrations, they're unrestricted, so you have an absolute prohibition. So what that would mean is that there's no restrictions or no exceptions are made. So the Prophet doesn't say don't break the bone of a dead Muslim if you're on the battlefield, or if you're doing it for revenge, or if you're doing it to be mean. He just says absolutely do not harm a dead person, and they make no exception for that, and therefore it applies as much to organ donation as it does to any other context. But so that would mean that primarily you're not allowed to donate organs or take out or procure organs. But then there's a secondary issue that there's conflicting obligations. So on the one hand, you have to maintain the sanctity and the dignity of the person who's passed away. But on the other hand, you also have an obligation to save somebody's life. And that's quite clear, and it's in the Quran, the oft quoted verse, whoever saves a soul, it's as if he had saved mankind entirely. So what do you do when you've got two different obligations which conflict with each other? How do you pick one over the other? There's a principle of arranging duties in accordance with their importance. So which one is more important? And for most people, saving a life takes precedence over preserving the sanctity of a deceased. It's something that is more important. And so even though there's a principle that you have to have preserved the sanctity of the person who's died, that you're not allowed to cut open their body to take out organs, because saving a life is so much more important, you're allowed to do it in certain circumstances. And then here there's a whole other discussion about what if it's only to improve a life, can you then donate, can you then take an organ or not? And in the UK, although for us this would be an added consideration, that we have a publicly funded healthcare system, so does that come into play as well? Because the money that we're using on dialysis we could potentially be using to save lives other places. So that's the first view. The first view is that the apparent meaning means that it's not allowed, but because we've got another obligation, it is allowed in certain circumstances. And here you'll see that a lot of restrictions are made about who you can and can't donate organs to as well. The second view, and this is a very minority view, and it's the likes of Ayatollah Fadlullah have this view, which is that you have to take into account the context of what the Prophet and of the narrations of the Prophet. And so Ayatollah Fadlullah says that mutilation has a connotation of revenge, so it's something that is done with a specific intent. And in a medical setting, that's not considered to be mutilation because it's not done with an intention of harming or causing any humiliation to the person who's died. And to back up this kind of approach, we have one of the earliest biographies of the Prophet, which Ibn Ishaq, when he talks about the incident of Uhud and the battle, and where the Prophet's uncle's body was mutilated, there's like, actually he quotes this thing where the women would go and they would cut off the ears and the noses of the people who had been slain in the battle, and they used it as jewelry, and this was like a common practice that was done. And after the incident of Uhud, when the Prophet's uncle was mutilated, he was so disturbed by it that after that he wouldn't go anywhere without telling people that mutilation is prohibited. And then there's other narrations as well that says that don't even mutilate a dead diseased dog. It was that bad. And so if these things are in that context, then you can't equate that with donating organs in a medical context. Also, if you look at any NHS guidance or talk to anybody who's working in this, in transplantation, or the nurses, they always emphasize how important it is for them to make sure that the person is respected as well. So, for example, they'll wash the person's hair, they'll make sure that the person looks respectable, that they can be viewed. So even after donating organs, the body can be, because some people have these open casket funerals, the body is still suitable to be viewed. Even something like you can donate a cornea, so they have to take out the eye, but then they'll put in a prosthetic eye and then shut the eye so you wouldn't be able to see. Or even if you donate skin, they only take it from the back, so an area which you can't see. All the stitches, everything is closed up just as it would be in a normal operation. So this approach would say that the mutilation, or the prohibition of mutilation, doesn't apply here, and therefore there is no prohibition on donating organs because it's not considered to be humiliation of somebody who's passed away. Okay, moving on, the majority opinion, so even if you can donate organs, the majority opinion is that it's problematic to donate organs after death unless it's necessary to save the life of a Muslim. And as I mentioned earlier, this restriction only applies after you've died, so during your life you don't have that restriction on you. And for a lot of these people, even when there is no will, so even if you don't agree to donate your organs, it's still necessary to take them if you need it to save the life of a Muslim. So Ayatollah Sistani, Ayatollah Khamenei, Ayatollah Fadlullah, they all say that even if you have no will, it's still necessary to take the organs, although obviously this doesn't play out in any country, I hope. It doesn't actually happen, but these are just what we have in rulings. The other thing is that the Muslim corpse or cadaver can only be used as a last resort. So you have to use a non-Muslim cadaver as far as possible. And that goes as far as, I think Ayatollah Asif Mohseni was even saying that if you can transport or fly in bodies from different countries, you have that doesn't work. That literally would not work, but still, if you can just get a non-Muslim body from a different country, that's as far as you have to go. And then also you can take organs with or without permission from infidels who belong to a land which is antagonistic with Islam. And from apostates. This then leads to a whole bunch of ethical and legal issues. First of all, in the UK, conditional organ donation after death is not allowed at all. This happened because there was a case in 1998 that was actually a white patient whose family said you can take his organs, but only if it goes to other white patients. So in that case, the doctors took it, they saved 5 lives or something. But then after that, there was this whole public outcry, and then the Department of Health said, no, we don't allow conditional organ donation because organs are donated altruistically and should go to patients in greatest need. So legally there's no way for you to make these concessions anyway. And then the more important thing is that it also raises some ethical questions. First of all, does this mean that Shia Muslims can't become donors according to the marjas who say you can only donate to Muslims? It would seem that that would mean you can't. But then this leads to ethical considerations like, do we have notions of equal value of life in Islam? What about the principle of reciprocity? So you treat others in a way that they treat you. Sajjadina mentions this. He says that this seems to be going against the ethos of Islam. And this principle, we find it in the Quran as well, that so long as they are upright towards you, be upright towards them. This is the sentiment that I think most people I speak to bring up. Most people say, well, if you can take an organ, why can't you give it? The question I was very interested in is, where does this discrimination come from? How do you justify taking organs and not giving organs, or saying that you should always take organs from non-Muslims before you can start taking organs from Muslims? I couldn't find anything that was actually referring to this at all. I couldn't find any justification for it. I did also write to Ayatollah Sistani's office, and I didn't get any clear response from that. So based on just speculation, it may be that these things originated from a different paradigm, where the world was divided into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, so Islamic lands and lands that were at war with Islam. And so we see that rights were linked to the place of residence, not just your religion. So even in Muslim lands, you could have protected entities. So this is going back to a paradigm where your rights depended on where you live, not just what your religion is. And so the kafir who lived in a land which is antagonistic with Islam had no rights and had no sanctities. And there was a really famous principle that the infidels and his possessions belonged to Muslims, so they had no protection. You were allowed, their life had no value, and their possessions and their spouses had no value. And then this becomes clear because when Muslims started to migrate, we see loads of juristic questions about, what about a Muslim who's moved to a non-Muslim land? Do they have the same protection as a Muslim in a Muslim land? What happens if we go to war? Are we allowed to then take their possessions or not? So it does seem that it was linked to place of residence. But now that we live in a whole different paradigm where we have the advent of the nation state and this notion of citizenship, does this paradigm even exist? There's not any such thing as this. And if it was going back to these kind of considerations, what place do they have now, and what place do they have in laws about organ donation? Also, as a side point, it raises this question about the obligation of taqleed as blind following. Can you do something just because you're told, purely for that, and then absolve yourself of any duty? The rationale of taqleed as blind following is simply that, well, you're not able to understand, so there's no reason to provide an explanation to you, which makes sense to a certain extent. But what happens when it contravenes a basic ethical principle? Because everybody who I've managed to speak to would say the same thing. Well, if I can take organs, why can't I give them? These are like basic principles. So here, what is the place of taqleed as blind following? And Ayatollah Fadl, I found that he was saying, what is meant by taqleed, that is resort to the expert in legal rulings, is not blind imitation. That is far removed from the rational spirit of Islam. Rather, taqleed is a conscious, considered venture. So it's something that you have to take on board, and it's something that you have to understand. So doing something which is so contrary to what you understand isn't necessarily justified. There's also secondary considerations, hukm thanawi, when it comes to things like not donating organs to non-Muslims. The most important is the image of Islam, and that comes across in like a lot of discussions about tatbir and zanjir, that even if it's allowed, what happens when it makes Islam, gives Islam a very bad image. And at that point people say you should, a lot of marjas say you should always take into consideration that you're not harming the image of Islam. So what about something like this, that we have these rules that you can't donate organs to non-Muslims? What does that do for the image of Islam at a time when the image of Islam, especially in the West, is already at a very fragile state, and the relationships are very fragile as well? So we see a minority move towards people who say that it's fine to donate organs, and they make no distinction between Muslims and non-Muslims. This includes Ayatollah Khamenei, who is differing from his predecessor Ayatollah Khomeini on this, Ayatollah Kamal Haidari, and Ayatollah Fadlullah, who actually says that Islam focuses on the human aspect, and so it's to do with, he calls organ donation a type of charity. So not just is it allowed or not allowed, but actually it's something that is a charity. I was looking at Ayatollah Sanai's own methodology. This isn't with regards to organ donation, but he was talking more generally and saying that rulings have to be formulated in accordance with egalitarian principles in the Quran. So the Quran talks about the preservation of life unrestrictedly. It doesn't make any distinctions there in that verse that we mentioned between Muslims and non-Muslims. Similarly, the Quran and the Sunnah endow all people with dignity. They don't make a distinction. So the Quran says we have honored the children of Adam. Human beings have been created from a single soul and are exhorted to be God conscious and complete in doing good deeds. Also, there's narrations like that. All humans are equal, just like the teeth of a comb, and people are either your brothers in faith or you're equal in humanity. They're saying from Imam Ali. So a different methodology is to frame all of these laws in accordance with the actual ethos of Islam. And the first and one of the basic things we get from the ethos of Islam is that all people have equality and equal dignity, and there's a value to preserving life. Just to conclude, what we've been through is that there's 3 areas of concern when it comes to organ donation after death. The first is that how do we define death? In the absence of a definition from the Quran and Sunnah, who is best placed to define death anyway? The second notion is how do we deal with these narrations that talk about mutilation? Is organ donation mutilation of the body? Do we go with the apparent meaning, or do we look at a contextual meaning in which we say, no, actually, in a clinical settings where it's done respectfully, that can't be called, and regular people don't call that mutilation. And the third problematic issue is the religion of the recipient of an organ. Can we justify taking an organ from somebody but not repaying the favor just because of the religion of the recipient? Thank you.